morning. I want to welcome everyone back to our second day of our AI conference. We're about to kick off panel 3, which is on artificial intelligence in the life sciences, and will be moderated by Mark Schultz, who is the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company Chair in Intellectual Property Law and Director of the Center for Intellectual Property Law and Technology at Akron Law, and is a Senior Scholar with the Center for Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy here at George Mason. See Mark's back. Turn it over to him to kick off the panel.
Thank you very much. So I am pleased to present today's panel. I'm pleased to moderate this panel on artificial intelligence and the life sciences. Artificial intelligence has the potential to transform radically the way life-saving products are developed and approved, from speeding up drug discovery and reducing costs associated with clinical testing to finding new uses for existing drugs using big data. This panel will explore whether and to what extent our system is set up to maximize AI's potential in this industry. So we're fortunate to have a distinguished panel with us, and I know our tradition with our conferences here is to refer you to the conference materials for further details on the panelists. We'll begin with Esther Bleicher. I'm pleased to have her with us, and Esther, please take it away. Thank you.
Hello. So I'm going to try to share my screen while talking at the same time, which never works that well. So, and let me just present. Okay. As this loads, I'm Esther Bleicher. I work at Ballo Health, that is involved in what we're calling, and what many others call too, sort of the end-to-end drug discovery and development, and using AI in as many ways as we can to accelerate that process. So this is a model of traditional drug discovery and development. It's serial, it's siloed. You do one thing, flip it over the wall, do another thing, flip it over the wall. And it's pretty inefficient. What I think about when I think about even the traditional way is that it's really all models. So the goal of drug development, even traditionally, is to predict the safety and effectiveness of a compound in the real world without putting patients at unreasonable risk. So each step along the way relies on evidence generated from different kinds of models with increasing fidelity to the real world use of a drug. So you have your preclinical mouse model, which we all know isn't great. It's good for some things, but how many times has cancer been cured in mice? And then it turns out that it doesn't work out in the end. So you start with the mouse, and then you go to maybe you're a non-human primate, finally a small set of healthy volunteers, so not even people with the disease, but you're trying to figure out something about toxicity there. And as you move along, even your phase 3 study is still just a model of the real world, because there are lots of controls that you have in place for the phase 3 study, more touch points with patients, and even a large phase 3 study that costs hundreds of millions of dollars is still fewer patients than who you would hope would take the drug in the real world. So this process is really set up to try to manage risk, spending the least amount of time and money up front. And then as you gain that evidentiary set, that you then spend the money and so the human risk at the end of the process. But it's not that great, right? The early models are not that predictive. Failure is very high. And here there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but I'd like to draw your attention to the probability of attrition, which is 9%. I mean, that's bad. And I've seen other numbers that are not exactly that, but it's the right order of magnitude. So, okay. So I think in a way, there's an embarrassment of riches where AI can do so much in so many different ways when it comes to discovery and development. And this is a picture from Valo. We have this Opal platform, but I think it's useful just to think about the industry as a whole, where you can pick any point along in this circle and use data to generate compute, or to using compute to analyze that data to generate algorithms that then helps you develop a better drug. And there are lots of different things that could happen here, right? So you can run virtual experiments to pick better molecules in the first case, drugs without toxicities that will kill your drug program, in addition to killing people, which is what you're trying to prevent, with fewer off-target effects because you have a big library of molecules that you're comparing your new compound to in silico. And then in the clinic, you can use models to pick the right people for those drugs, even identify new diseases or subpopulations of existing diseases that are more likely to benefit or more likely to not have a particular kind of adverse event. And this can also, by picking the right patients, you can enroll fewer people for less time and then have a greater likelihood of success. In addition, there's the possibility of using AI in manufacturing. So wouldn't it be awesome to have a 6-month stability study that you can do in an hour because you're doing it computationally? And then with CMC, perhaps identifying new ways of manufacturing compounds that would limit or reduce impurities, toxicities, and particularly if you're thinking about repurposing a drug that maybe was put on the shelf because of some manufacturing issues. If you can use AI to create a new way of manufacturing that solves those problems, then you can build IP around that. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation. There's, again, so much that can be done here, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of it. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Esther. And I apologize for not fully stating your title. I had a couple last-minute connectivity problems. That was Esther Bleicher, Chief Counsel, Therapeutics and Product and Technology of Valo Health. Next up on our panel is Corey Salzberg, who's the Vice President and Global Head of IP Affairs for Novartis. Corey, take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. Let me just get my slides up. Hopefully these will work seamlessly. Let's see. There we are. Great, so unless you're talking about a Roomba, AI does not exist in a vacuum. So like any other technology, we really need to view it in the context of what the broader goals that we're trying to achieve as a company and as an industry, as a tool really to help us achieve those goals and help us shape the future that we all want to see. So as a starting point, whenever I talk about AI, I really like to talk about the overall forces that are shaping our future and then move on to how AI is helping us do that. So there's really 4 major things shaping the future of the biopharma industry. The first thing is that we continue to experience major revolutions in our understanding of disease. So, fields like genomics and genetics, we now can understand the root causes of disease in many cases, and the personalized nature of many diseases, which of course leads us to things like gene therapy, gene editing, and personalized or precision medicine. Second big trend is that along with these revolutions in science and our ability to use new tools, new digital tools to mine lakes of existing data and to collect new troves of real-world patient data, come massive amounts of information and a real need, to be able to evaluate those. So those can be valuable to advancing medicine. To give some real, scientific examples of that, our DNA has 3.2 billion base pairs of information, which I always like to say is it's enough to stretch from the sun to Pluto and back again 17 times. Our microbiomes have about 100 times that number, so 100 trillion cells in each of us. So as you can see, we really need solutions to be able to analyze vast amounts of data like that. Third is economics. The R&D costs in our industry have been rising for decades, along with pricing pressures from strained healthcare budgets, which of course will only continue to rise as we go into economic recovery after this pandemic. In the healthcare system, they're increasingly, in most countries, only willing to pay if you can show the value that your medicine brings. And value, of course, is a factor of better outcomes and lower costs against the status quo. And what that means for us is that we really need new ways to make R&D more efficient and to maximize the use of data so that we can ensure that our treatments are as effective and as tailored as possible. And finally, we have good old-fashioned survival. The importance of data in healthcare has really changed the dynamics of competition in our industry. So in addition to staying ahead of our peers, we need to contend with new entrants to our field from the tech sector. So where does that mean in terms of where we're going? Starting with where we are, as Esther referenced a little bit, this is kind of another way of looking at it. The basic blueprint of today's, or at least conventional, R&D, we have to analyze in that world about 10,000 compounds to get to one successful drug candidate. Even when we put it into the clinic, we have a 12% success rate, or flip that around, an 88% failure rate. The whole process takes 10 to 15 years per drug on average and costs around $2.5 billion. All of which is to say it's a whole lot of inefficiency that is inherent right now in the system, but a whole lot of opportunity for AI to make it more efficient. So what are some of the things we're doing? Starting with drug discovery, the earliest phases of drug development, we alone have over 1 billion compounds in our compound library at Novartis, which is, of course, in the traditional sense, just way too many to actually, it takes forever to go through all those and assess them against a particular target of interest. But AI is starting to change that with tools like you can see in the bottom left of the screen there, like the kind of facial recognition software that we use for Facebook or for security applications. Using similar tools, we can now use AI and machine learning to teach a computer to identify similarities in chemical structures, for example, between different candidates with ones already known to bind with a target of interest, such as a cell or receptor on a cell. We're not only using AI, though, to identify connections that we already know. Using deep learning tools, we can now start to ask it to identify its own connections that we've not been able to make before due to the vast sizes of the data sets. And also in a field called generative chemistry, we're now actually able to use software to use connections to profile, to have AI profile and propose virtual molecules as drug candidate starting points so that our scientists can then step in, further develop them, and test and refine them. And some people say that with approaches like this, we will have fully AI-designed therapeutic proteins by 2030. We then have the clinical trial process, where AI-assisted digital tools are already helping us to really make our clinical trials more efficient. You can see at the top there, this is a picture of a center we call Nerve Live. It's a set of AI-driven tools that we kind of call, we think of it like air traffic control for clinical trials. It's able to look at the entire universe of thousands of clinical trials that we have going on in our company around the world at one given time, identify inefficiencies and address them early. We are also using AI and digital tools to take clinical trials out of the lab and into people's homes so we can bring in more diverse patient pools, expand the patient pools, reduce our costs, and increase efficiencies. And eventually, AI is also helping us, but really, we may get to the point where we can eliminate a lot of clinical trials altogether by looking at past clinical trials. So we have about 2 million patient years of data already stored up from past clinical trials. We are now in the process in a program we call Data 42 of cleaning and converting all of that data to a usable form so that we can use AI tools to find correlations in it to actually potentially get candidates for new drugs without even starting clinical trials. For example, you might identify side effects that were seen in different trials among different patients, see a connection that you didn't previously appreciate, and then take that drug and test an existing drug for a new use. AI also has an incredible array of important uses after drug approval that are important to remember. We're using it for everything from diagnosing diseases like leprosy and MS to better understanding the treatment efficacy of particular drugs, to helping with disease management, like the tool you see at the bottom there on your screen, which is a tool that we've launched in China called AI Nurse and helping with heart patients in China. So over time, the point is that all of this in all these different ways is already starting to lead to faster, more efficient, and more successful R&D. So that is the promise of AI in biopharma, but enabling that kind of near-term and longer-term future really requires that we have the right policies and the right laws in place, including good IP policies in two areas. One is to make sure that we actually continue to robustly incentivize the tools that we need to make these things happen. And the other is to make sure that the downstream innovations that come out of the use of AI with this and the assistance of AI are still receiving the incentives they need to be further developed. And the first set of questions that I have in this area, and I think a lot of people do, is whether we do have the right incentives in place to keep creating these tools. This is not clear. I will leave for the panel the details of this, but of course, everyone in the IP world is familiar with the pressures of Section 101 in the US and similar concerns in other countries, written description and enablement issues, and trade secret questions. If we're going to rely on those instead, is that really the best way forward for society? And can we really have robust enough incentives through there? I think the more interesting set of questions in a lot of ways is what happens to the downstream inventions. And of course, the most famous question there is whether patents are available when an AI helps to invent or entirely invents certain downstream inventions. So far, of course, the answer from the courts in the US, the EU, and the UK has been no, at least where there's no human inventor. And here, I think it's really important to ask the right question, which is not whether AI is fully inventing things, but whether it's when AI helps with something, whether there's enough left that the human is doing to effectively render the human activity non-inventive. And we saw this in the copyright space with Naruto, the Indonesian macaque, who took a camera from a photographer, took a selfie, and the courts found that an animal can't be an author, but it also found that the photographer was not the author of the copyright because it didn't do enough, and therefore no one got the copyright. At least under US inventorship law, my position is that, we already have AI doing a lot, narrowing millions of potential compounds down to a few to be tested, predicting the most promising structures, making new correlations, and starting to propose whole new virtual molecules to test. We're starting to get closer, and I think there's a real question to the point of whether the human guidance in the front end or the work at the tail end is enough to really constitute inventorship, or is it more like setting the aperture and the speed on a camera? Let me just finally, I'll skip over the others for now because I know we'll talk about them on the panel. Let me just end with a couple of additional policy concerns and frame those up for discussion. When we talk about AI and IP, we're usually doing it in the Roomba, to use that reference again, of academic conferences like these, but in real life, these debates, of course, are going to play out against a backdrop, and already somewhat are, of politics, ideology, national security, and morality considerations. And we can speculate a little bit how some of these may impact IP policy around AI by looking at the bigger policy trends that we've already seen happen in related fields. So, for example, under the TRIPS agreement internationally at the WTO, there's already exceptions to patenting for inventions that violate public order or morality and diagnostic, therapeutic, and surgical methods. The US and other countries have already used some of these. The US bans patents on nuclear weapons. India recently rejected patents on sex devices on a moral basis. AI has already been compared in some instances to both of those technologies. There's also the question of bias and inequity in AI decision-making with a moral component, particularly in the medical field, and even questions eventually of whether it will be moral to patent and own an AI as it grows more intelligent and arguably more sentient. You add to that the overall drug pricing and access debate in our field, as we've seen happen in the TRIPS waiver, people trying to use IP to get to that. And I think we're going to face a situation where any gap in our IP laws is really going to lend itself to being exploited for goals other than sound innovation policy. So I'll stop there. I hope that sets up some interesting topics for conversation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Corey. Next up, we have Derek Scott, the Senior Director and Associate General Counsel at Genentech. Derek, please take it away. Thanks.
Thanks so much. So maybe I'll just go without slides. How about that? So thank you, Mark, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation from the Center of Intellectual Property Innovation Policy for inviting me. Good morning, everyone. It was wonderful to hear Esther and Corey provide what a wonderful framework. And I just want to provide some thoughts on the potential of AI in medicine by talking about,
hey, Derek, it looks like we have your slides now. Huh.
Oh, great. That's great. Thank you, Christina. I'll tell you when to switch. So I just want to start perhaps with telling the story a little bit about Genentech and how we see AI. I think as folks may know, Genentech is based in South San Francisco. We are part of the larger Roche family of companies, and we have pioneered the field of biological medical products or biologics and continue to do so by really tackling some of the toughest medical problems. At Genentech, we are seeing the next revolution in medicine evolving, and it's one that sits at the interface of AI, interface of bioinformatics and software and biology. And just to be clear, when I use the term AI, it's really a targeted definition. The tools that we're using are largely computational modeling, statistical analysis, neural networks, data science, machine learning, deep learning. And I think Corey mentioned this, the idea of a more general artificial intelligence where self-aware or intelligent machines, that's definitely in the future, but not really reflective or representative of how we currently use AI. But if you could go to the next slide, please. With that said, let me give you a glimpse. So historically, doctors had approaches that treated all patients the same way, right? These one-size-fits-all medicines. And really the challenge here is that sometimes they didn't work in the same way for each patient. Sometimes they didn't work at all. If you go to the next slide. But over time, the industry developed targeted therapies that helped treat patients who didn't respond to these one-size-fits-all medicines. Clearly, the field is at a much better point than it was in the past, but there's still a huge unmet medical need here. In some cancers, for example, for every 10 patients, on average, maybe half will benefit. And so that leaves many who are without efficacious treatments. If you go to the next slide. But with AI, we are now on the path to potentially help patients receive the right treatment for the disease at the right time. We believe AI can help and enable us to create truly personalized medicines. Medicines that will allow our scientists to concentrate on the subtle differences that make each patient unique and deliver more personalized, targeted therapies that we hope will yield safer, more effective, and perhaps more cost-efficient outcomes. And thanks for the advancements in AI and bioinformatics, we at Genentech are in the process of exploring a number of personalized cancer treatments, medicines that target and are unique to each and every patient. And to create these personalized cancer treatments, we pair cutting-edge technologies like next-generation sequencing that helps us understand the tumor microenvironment or the tumor mutations that are unique for that patient, other defining molecular features. And we pair that then with sophisticated algorithms and AI to carefully select a therapeutic intervention that's actually specific for the patient's tumor. We believe these treatments that are coming are more targeted, more sophisticated, and we hope more effective. If you could go to the next slide. So in addition to the promise of AI to deliver and hopefully enable personalized medicine, we also see AI as being really important in the development of digital health products like digital diagnostics and digital therapeutics. And I want to provide just a couple of examples. In ophthalmology, we're seeing a great potential for improved patient outcomes through personalized medicine. When we apply AI and deep learning approaches to images of the eye, for example, we can gain insights into whether a given patient with retinal disease will progress or not progress. We can help doctors improve the accuracy of their diagnoses. And this potentially allows us to tailor therapeutic strategies, either intensifying treatment for those more aggressive disorders, or perhaps taking a less aggressive approach for others. And in the future, we believe that perhaps we can allow patients to take retinal scans using their smartphones and having doctors help monitor the retinal disease in real time from a different location. Similarly, in the area of AI-powered digital pathology, AI approaches hold great promise for optimizing pathologist workflows and better predict, therapy responses. But in addition, as Corey and Esther have already mentioned, the potential of AI in medicine goes far beyond these examples. We are starting to see AI impact basic experimental design and analysis by helping our scientists develop more efficient experiments. As Corey and Esther mentioned, AI holds great promise in drug discovery and clinical trial design and operations. As Esther mentioned as well, AI can help us improve manufacturing operations. So everything from quality control, reducing materials waste, forecasting demand, helping us manage potential failures in the production line. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. But to echo a theme that Corey raised, really AI in biotech industry and in life sciences has some significant challenges. As Corey mentioned, really incentivizing and maintaining the appropriate incentives is really key to enable and accelerate the development of these future medicines. And I just want to really focus on one of the challenges. So if you go to the next slide, please. As Esther and Corey mentioned, the biotechnology innovation requires significant investments in R&D. At Genentech, we invest billions of dollars a year. The costs have gone up significantly for launching a medicine. Currently, I think the estimates are around $2.6 billion. It takes approximately 12 years, millions of hours of work, and thousands of experiments to go from basic research to regulatory approval. And so it's no surprise that in order to project this significant investment in these technologies, there has to be no question that such personalized medicines, the diagnostics, and the AI-based innovations that underpin and enable some of these new medicines and therapies are patent eligible. And I think equally that the way these claims to these inventions are treated in the patent office is clear and reliable over time. Yet for the last several years, we and others have had to navigate ambiguity in the state of patent eligibility. We have had to address many rejections on 101 grounds, even when inventions pass all other sections. In our view, the innovation clearing merits protections. For us and many in the industry, these challenges arise both on the biology side, so from a natural product or law of nature exemptions, and the tech side, where, as I think many people here attending today appreciate, that bioinformatics and AI-based inventions are often characterized as unpatentable abstract ideas or mental processes. And frankly, the current trajectory of Section 101 case law has only really served to expand the confusion of what is and what is not patent eligible, at least in the United States. And so I think, one of the challenges and one of the hopes is that having clarification of Section 101 is really important to incentivize investment in this area. And I want to just thank you for your attention, and I'll stop my comments now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. And our final panelist for the first round of presentations is Trevor Cook, who is a partner at WilmerHale. Trevor, please take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. And thanks to my co-panelists for setting the scene. As you'll hear from my voice, I'm a Brit, and even though I work in the United States, my qualifications are as an English lawyer. And so what I shall be doing is focusing on some European perspectives on some of the issues which my co-panelists have raised. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I have provided the organizers with a handout, which I'm sure you'll be able to access in due course, with a number of links to some of the things about which I'll be talking. And the first two items on that are, in fact, two non-paywalled scientific papers published this last year which demonstrate the use of AI in drug discovery, one in relation to, entitled Machine Learning Identifies Candidates for Drug Repurposing in Alzheimer's Disease, and that's from a group in Massachusetts. And the other one is Identification of SARS-CoV-2 Induced Pathways Reveals Drug Repurposing Strategies, and that's from a group in Cambridge in the UK and also Germany. Oh yes, they've gone up on the chat. That's excellent, thanks. And so that gives you a little more granularity on how AI is being used, at least in the way in which it's being published in the academic literature. Then to talk more generally about European perspectives on these issues. we have been considering the policy issues in the EPO level, in the EU level, in the UK. And there are broadly, from a legal point of view, the two issues. One is, as Corey, I think, categorized it, IP on AI, and the second is IP on AI outputs. And, outside the United States, we have our own issues with our own, if you like, sort of correspondences to Section 101 in the United States. We have the exclusion from patentability for computer programs as such in Europe. Although that said, I'm not so conscious that has as yet been too much of an issue in Europe. It's still early days in relation to patenting AI, but I gave a couple of examples in my paper of two recently granted patents on AI inventions themselves to DeepMind, and those seem to have undergone a fairly straightforward prosecution without any patent eligibility issues arising in relation to that. But I'm sure, but patent eligibility is a real concern with these inventions, although outside the United States, I think, as Corey mentioned, the current topic du jour tends to be the question of inventorship and as to whether AI can be designated as an inventor. Outside the United States, we're a little less concerned with who is an inventor or the nature of inventorship than one is in the United States. And so to some extent outside the United States, I feel much of this controversy is something of a distraction from the real issues associated with AI. I mean, as Corey said, so far in the UK, it's been determined that an AI cannot be designated as an inventor, but that's a split decision of the Court of Appeal, and it could go to the Supreme Court. I know the ex-patent judge who is on the Supreme Court, on our Supreme Court, Lord Kitchen, has already expressed interest in public writings, speeches on these issues. And so it could well be an appropriate case to go to our Supreme Court in due course. And the Australian court, in quite a very fully reasoned judgment, has actually held that AI can be an inventor. But I think, as I say, I think it's a little bit of a distraction from the real issues with which we're concerned, because I think most people in the present state of AI see it mainly as being a tool and used by the people who are managing the AI program. And so, for example, in those scientific papers which I referenced, you have various human authors identified as being behind them. And I think if it becomes an issue, then it's a matter, at least in Europe, which is something which is susceptible of legislative change. It's not sort of embedded in anybody's constitution, the question of AI inventorship. So there's patent eligibility, and that's probably all I was going to say about IP on AI itself. But I think, to me, the more troubling issue, and I think this really links to the particular topic of this session, which is that of AI in life sciences, is the whole question of IP on AI outputs. What people are producing in life sciences, and the whole purpose of this is to get better treatments, and that's what we've heard about in the previous three presentations. And certainly from a European perspective, that's where I start to get rather troubled by the potential consequences of AI. I mean, we've already seen without AI that life sciences patenting in Europe is quite tough, especially insofar as it can be attributed to, let me say, systematic research. And we've seen in practice that it's been very, you can probably get a patent, but it can be very hard in practice to preserve the validity, to challenge, particularly of patents to new formulations, new medical uses, new dosage regimens, new combinations. No matter how good the therapeutic benefit that each of these confers, if it can be put down to the product of organized research, it is, from a patent litigator's point of view, can be quite tough to preserve the validity of such patents. And yet, even patents to new chemical entities or new active substances, they're under attack they have their problems in Europe, especially if you've got claims of broad scope. They're open to plausibility objections, insufficiency objections, and sort of claim scope obviousness, or, in the particular terminology of EPO practice, Agrevo type obviousness application, Agrevo type obviousness objections. And so that's the present background in Europe. And so I think AI is at risk, particularly when you start factoring it into inventive step, of raising the inventive step threshold yet further. And I think there may, from that point of view, be an element of truth in the provocatively entitled paper, which was published in 2018 in the UCLA Law Review by Ryan Abbott, who gave the keynote speech yesterday. And the paper was entitled "Everything is Obvious." And he was talking about patentability in general, but I think in the life sciences area, this is a particular concern, given what I've said, at least in Europe, as to the framework within which we see life sciences patenting occurring. Now, I emphasize that that's not necessarily a concern that is shared or voiced by those in industry, although I did see that Corey flagged it up as one of the topics on his presentation. Looking at the responses, for example, to the UK IPO consultation exercise, show views from bodies that, amongst others, represent pharma, and they saw it as being possible to integrate AI or sort of AI output inventions into traditional concepts of the person skilled in the art. But where is this leading? Well, to conclude, we already have a situation in Europe in which patents have, I think, started to take something of a back seat, at least in terms of business planning, to data to another form of protection, data exclusivity. And in Europe, data exclusivity, which provides a protection almost absolute for 10 or 11 years after a first marketing authorization, is not keyed to patents, is not linked to patents. And it is keyed to, if you like, what we're really talking about here, which is getting good new therapies to patients. And so, data exclusivity, for example, as a form of protection, is not challenged by AI, unless we get to the stage where you can actually replicate an awful lot of clinical trial work by AI. And I was very interested in Corey's observations in relation to that. and then we may sort of start looking at other forms of exclusivity as well, sort of analogous to orphan drug exclusivity and so on and so forth. But anyway, I mean, in Europe, given the background we have, I see AI and AI output inventions as only exacerbating that sort of trend. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Trevor. A couple of things as we move forward. We have a couple of follow-up questions prepared for the panelists and some things that their presentation sparked. But I encourage the audience to post questions in the Q&A queue. I've already reviewed some and taken them on board for asking in a bit. But please do contribute to the Q&A. I'm monitoring it and happy to pass on questions. The other thing I need to do I'm required to do is state the CLE passwords so that those of you seeking CLE, as many of you are, get your credit. It's AVA, Alpha Victor Alpha. It's also posted in the chat. Okay, so we have a couple of questions that some of our panelists covered to a small degree or large degree, but I want a chance to ask everybody about them. And we're focusing first on intellectual property issues raised by AI. And so the first question is, how well is the current IP framework suited to protect innovation in the use of AI? And do there need to be any changes? And I guess one of our follow-ups we talked about is whether there's an existing form of IP that's better than others. So I guess I'll go in the order that we asked the first question, since we haven't heard from Esther for a while now. So Esther, I'll let you go first and hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I think that so first of all, I'm not an IP lawyer. I have a new IP colleague who is wonderful. And I think one of the things she's most excited about is the level of creativity that she expects to have to bring to bear on some of these issues. So I think that the issues that have been raised by Corey and Derek and Trevor are ones that IP lawyers are grappling with in this space and really trying to figure out how to get the value from the innovation and the inventions that are coming out of this new technology. So I don't have any specific fabulous answers to the question that you raised, but I really look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say.
So I guess it's my turn. Couple things. I mean, I set up a lot of these already, and we could all talk all day about all these things, I'm sure. So we won't do that. But I agree with Trevor. Obviousness is an issue, and just to explain that a little more for people who may not be familiar with the issue, the question is, right, obviousness, especially for those non-IP lawyers, is based on a standard of what a person of ordinary skill in the art would think or do or would have done, given the state of the art at the time. And when you start to inject artificial intelligence as a person, as an inventor, right, you displace the human being with, even now, if you think about Google, right, Google has access or whatever, as computer programs have access, even a calculator is much more skilled at math in some ways than human beings, because it can instantly calculate things and has access to everything. So if you displace a human mind with that kind of an all-knowing, even if it's not doing thinking, entity, you could make the argument that these connections that that we can't make as human beings, but that machines can easily make, means that everything is obvious. So that's a simplified version of it. So that is something that I think that will have to be looked at down the road, although I don't think we're yet there. And that's a longer term issue. One more thing I'll touch on and then turn to others. On the patent side, just to reiterate something I hopefully explained well, there is a lot of talk right now, and it's the hot topic at conferences and also even in the law, and you've seen it in the cases with the Daubus example that Ryan Abbott and Professor Thaler are putting through the courts about whether AI can be an inventor. But my point is that I think that is actually, agree with Trevor, that's a sideshow in a way. because as I tried to explain with the Naruto or the monkey example, we don't need to get to the question of whether AI is the inventor. The question in my mind, especially in our field, is whether the human being that assists the AI has done enough. So like when we tell inventor stories in our field, I mean, stories in the sense that this is why it's an invention, part of it is, it's not simple, but the difficult process actually of starting with 10,000 compounds on average and having that aha moment where a human being says, I just noticed this connection between these two, between the shape of a structure and a receptor or whatever, some chemical bond that happens, that's the invention, right? If AI starts to do that and all that is left that the human did is, programmed a couple of algorithms in general, I think that over time, we're going to start to get this question of, even if the AI is not an inventor, and even if it, whether it is or isn't or can or can't be, isn't the question, it's what has the human done, and does that satisfy the US, take the US, definition of conception has to be the formation in the mind of the inventor of the complete and operative idea, or whatever, I forgot the exact language, right? It has to be every element of the claim has to exist in a human mind. And when you start taking some of those elements away from the human mind and putting some of them in the AI, I think you potentially could get into situations where that starts to get challenged. We're not there yet, but I think that's an issue. So I'll stop there, but there's a lot of others. That's one thought.
Thanks, Corey. Derek?
Yeah, great comments. And I think I'll take it from a different perspective. So if we think about copyright, trade secrets, and patents, right, and the intersect, I think we all appreciate that they all bring different things to bear. And obviously having the right incentives and all of them together can help protect these kinds of innovations. But if you look at them individually, copyright, for example, given the amount of effort and developing, the amount of time, energy, and resources that go into developing AI innovations in life sciences, copyright's kind of pretty flimsy, right, by itself, right, to protect it fully. Trade secret, I think, is where oftentimes we wrestle a little bit. You can imagine that there are aspects of AI when we think about just patenting AI. Now, I'm just looking at that side of the equation, right? Maybe there are aspects that trade secret works, but one of the downsides that I think we see, particularly from when we look at the more macro level, what's really in the best interest for society, the public and patients, is really the publication aspect, right? That is important to really allow others to build upon the innovations, build upon other innovation, right? And continue building. And so if we go to a place where patents really are not incentivized and patents really can't protect many of these innovations, and we go to a trade secrets, I actually think that in the long term, the macro level is really not the right policy decision, because frankly, we could stifle additional innovation and acceleration of innovation going forward. And I think as Corey, Trevor, Esther mentioned a little bit with regards to patent protection, right? There are some challenges, and do we have the right policy incentives right now? I think part of this is just the technology is going so far, and we really are catching up, so to speak. But these are really important questions to address, both from eligibility, but as Corey and Trevor talked about, obviousness. We haven't even touched about 112 issues, which I think do come into play here. And I'll stop there to give Trevor some time to provide his perspective.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I already touched on the patent aspects from a sort of non-US point of view. And as I said in my presentation, I think the eligibility issues have not really come to the fore in Europe as yet in relation to artificial intelligence, although, and in a way, the eligibility issues have sort of settled down in Europe. The way in which the European Patent Office addresses the whole question of the exclusion from patentability for computer programs as such, by wrapping that up in the obviousness analysis and then saying, is there a further technical effect over and above running the program on the computer, seems to have settled down. And we don't know how that's going to actually play in relation to some of the AI inventions and the question of IP on AI. But I think there is a real risk if it proves difficult or problematic to get patent protection on AI, that people are very much going to rely on trade secrets in relation to protecting AI itself. And we may already be seeing that because, patents have a finite term. Trade secrets potentially can last forever. And, these are an ideal subject in a way for trade secrets because the output does not tell you anything about how the output was generated. So, one way or another, that is going to get protected. And if the patent system doesn't do it, then I can see trade secrets doing that. And that may not be to the benefit of society. An observation on copyright in relation to AI. In Europe, we have this concept that copyright can only subsist in works which are the author's own intellectual creation. And so, to pick up on Derek's point about the monkey selfie case, yes, there's no question there. That's not a copyright work. But equally, from a European perspective, just the automatic copyright, the automatic photographs which you get when you come off a fairground wheel or something like that, those are produced by a machine. Those are not produced by an individual. And so there's no author's intellectual creation for those. So I think we have a fairly clear idea that copyright, at least in the sort of strict sense of copyright, Berne Convention sense of copyright in Europe, is not something which can protect AI. I think people are pretty comfortable with that. If they want to protect AI, if they want to protect copyright-like type works produced by AI, then we can start talking about related rights and things like that. And I know that in an American sense, that's difficult because you have to incorporate all sorts of copyright under the same rubric of what's in the Constitution. But if we need it in Europe, we could do it. We don't have any constitutional problem with that. So that's where I would stand on copyright. And I always find the sort of application of copyright in these areas troubling anyway, because copyright's very good for protecting a computer program against specific bit-for-bit copying of that computer program. When you start getting into look and feel type issues, it gets much more fuzzy, much more troubling. And I think there's a whole interesting background to in the United States. You used to see how before there was a perception that computer programs could be protected by patents. You had a lot of cases on look and feel. Now that it's becoming problematic to protect computer programs by patents, you're starting to see more copyright cases looking at issues like look and feel. So, nature abhors a vacuum, and IP lawyers abhor it as well. So we'll always find something to come back on.
Any reactions among the panelists to things your fellow panelists have said so far?
Mark, I'll just make an observation to maybe expand a little bit on, I think both Trevor and Derek touched on this. The societal downside to moving to, I agree, trade secrets, right? They last forever, and it may be, the way we go if the patent system is not fit for purpose here. We're starting to see, the complaints already today in the pandemic about know-how and trade secrets and how people don't like that. I think in the AI space, it takes on even a greater, societal importance, because it's not just about whether others can do what you're doing, which is important, of course, for innovation, because all innovation is built on looking what others have done and building from there and learning from it. But there's also things like, people want to know what algorithms are doing. They're concerned about things like bias in the way algorithms decide things, rightly so. I think in some cases, they want to know what data sets look like to make sure the data is not biased. They want to make sure that AI technology is safe, right? We're all going to be driving or sitting in autonomous vehicles before long. I don't think we want that level of secrecy around these things. And if you want to incentivize while also avoiding that level of secrecy, I don't see what choice you have but to strengthen something like the patent system, which encourages people to actually publish and to be more public about what they're doing, and eventually have term limits, of course, too. So I think it's a broader consideration than just which form of protection is better for the innovator. Society really needs to think hard and make sure that it's having policies that satisfy all of those different interests and not just, we want access to the technology as fast as possible or whatever.
I'll piggyback off of that a little bit, because in addition to the public need or sort of outcry about AI being a black box and really wanting to have explainable AI, other regulators are thinking about that too. And so one thing that I think about as a generalist is how FDA is going to be thinking about algorithms, and particularly algorithms that are diagnostics, wanting to have that level of transparency. I think even maybe as we speak, there's an FDA public meeting on transparency in AI-generated algorithms. And so if FDA is requiring that companies provide a level of transparency that might trip up their trade secret protection, then it puts more pressure on what exactly Corey was saying.
So one thing I know, I work on trade secrecy a lot, and one comment I'd have is there's an emerging commentary in this field. I've read some papers recently and seen some presentations that say that comment that we really need to think about what we mean by trade secrecy for AI, or maybe the other way around. When we talk about AI, what are we protecting? And I think that's one reason we're having this conference, right? Is to really start to think about if we're talking about assembling big databases, for example, and using them for machine learning. Some commentators are pointing out that those likely, if we're assembling public data, those likely are readily ascertainable and may not meet the test for trade secrecy. Ultimately, algorithmic transparency is a really interesting question, and I suppose we'll have to work that out in public policy, just when those kind of things have to be fully disclosed, right? Versus when they're partially disclosed to regulators. I want to follow up on some audience questions. Although candidly, a couple of them are more in the form of comments. One person asks, how can you even talk about AI and IP if we haven't resolved the issue of Mail, Myriad, and Athena? I think that's expressing a concern about the ongoing concern about patentable subject matter, the question in the US. Another question is I guess maybe phrased in the way of a statement or a complaint that US drug prices are higher, but it does bring up a pricing question. And that I think it's always of interest to observers and the public. Is there any way in which AI is likely to reduce costs of R&D and potentially thus drug prices? Although I know drug prices aren't just based on the cost of R&D, although we talk about that a lot, they're also based on demand and the importance and value they deliver. But anyone want to comment on the potential for AI, what AI might do in that regard?
I'll take that one. I'll start that one, Mark, and then others I'm sure will have thoughts too. I mean, I think you already started to answer the question. Pricing, I think it's unfortunate that there's a lot of the narrative around pricing has moved towards, what were the costs? And part of that, we're to blame, I think, as an industry for probably, not in the right way explaining how the costs of R&D factor into drug pricing, because I don't think we've ever intended to suggest that a particular drug is priced according to how much it costs to invent. Our point is that collectively, drug discovery and R&D has been incredibly expensive. And as you saw in my chart and others have said too, the data is clear that the costs of R&D on average have gone up over time. So in order to sustain, the kind of the scope and the scale of an R&D program to address all these unmet medical needs and to keep investing and have the failure rates that we have, you do have to have, an overall set of returns that's able to keep funding that and accounting for the cost of failure. But there's no, I don't think it's ever been the case, and it's certainly not the case today, where people are saying it cost X to invent this drug, so we're going to charge Y for it, or charge X plus whatever. That is not how drugs are priced, and it's not how we think drugs should be priced. Really, putting completely aside the AI question, the whole pricing model has been moving, and we are big supporters of it, towards value-based pricing, where you are looking at what is the value that a particular drug is delivering to a particular healthcare system and society. And that is country by country. In the United States, there are things like, I'm not an expert here, but things like quality adjusted life years. It sounds cruel and cold and terrible, but this is how healthcare and health technology, assessment systems work. They look at the economic value of a human life in their society, and they look at how many productive years a drug, may be adding back to it. There are other calculations like how much you've saved for the healthcare system versus the current standard of care. So if you're avoiding hospitalization with a one-time treatment or with a pill, that may be a big savings. And all these things come together into a calculation that should justify value for cost. That has nothing to do with the cost of R&D. So I think that in that sense, these things won't and shouldn't affect the actual price of a drug. At the same time, I do think that because overall cost efficiencies and R&D successes will go up, I think that AI is going to help us target drugs to particular patients on the personalized side, get better outcomes, and that will actually make everything more cost effective because you won't be wasting drugs and treatments on people where they're not really going to benefit. I do think that if overall costs go down, you'll have more competition, more options. So it will actually bring drug costs down, but it's not a one-to-one, I think, the way the question might have been suggesting.
Anyone else like to comment on that? Okay, the always difficult pricing question. At one point, Esther, please do.
If you want to move on, that's also fine. I agree with most of what Corey said. I do hope that with the increase in success rates that we expect AI to be able to produce, and also the reduction in uncertainty, the reduction in risk, the hopefully savings in terms of both the amount of time that it takes to go through drug development, but also the actual costs, like if you don't have to do a several hundred or 1,000 person clinical study, but you can do a much smaller one that's more targeted because your models are better and you can better select those patients, then that society should see that value. And it would be really wonderful, if in a world, in the United States, where not everybody has a government payer or a payer at all, there are many uninsured patients, that those patients also get to receive care that's affordable.
Thanks, Esther. I had a question that's somewhat of a technical question, but I think it's a fairly interesting one. And it actually, I can key off of something Esther said. Somebody was wondering just how AI would be used in clinical trials, and I think maybe we could understand that certainly there's a lot of information, a lot of monitoring and data collation and management that goes on in those that certainly some form of automation or AI could help. But what about the actual clinical trial? What is it that substitutes for having 20,000, 30,000 patients, and instead we use the AI for to improve the clinical trial? How does that? What's going on there when you do that, Esther, or anybody else would like to talk about it?
So one way that we're thinking about doing that is really just doing a better job of predicting which patients are going to benefit from a trial. So instead of it saying, okay, it's a trial for anybody with cardiovascular disease, or I'll use a different example, a trial for anybody with Parkinson's disease. At Valo, we have been able to look at, using real world data, different populations of people who have Parkinson's disease. And it appears as though there are several different subpopulations that might have different underlying biology. And so if instead of enrolling all Parkinson's patients, you only enroll that subset of patients that are most likely to benefit, then you can have a much smaller sample size because you have a greater likelihood that you're going to see the effectiveness that you want to see. So that's one way. Another way is if AI can help you understand that underlying biology and can help you understand the mechanism of action better, then you might be able to identify surrogate endpoints. So instead of waiting until, say, a patient dies, because that's all that we've got, if we have a better understanding of the underlying disease biology, then we can say, actually, this is a point at which I can do an assay and figure out, yeah, this is a clinically meaningful endpoint, or this is a predictive of a clinically meaningful endpoint. And so then you can end your study earlier and get drugs to patients faster. So those are two ways.
Thank you. Any other comments on that point?
I guess just quickly, I mean, two other ways that we've all talked about them a little bit. I mean, one is that looking at things like real world data, you can actually eliminate certain phases, at least, of certain trials, not just get new leads, but I think there's already been some drugs that have been submitted for new uses based on looking at what happens in the real world to patients that are already on a drug and then noticing certain side effects. And you've been able to really kind of skip some of the formal clinical trial phases from that. And we're going to see more of that. And then one other aspect that I tried to touch on briefly is, although it's not just AI, it's also just a factor of digital tools and digital technology. The ability to bring clinical trials into people's homes is really transformational, because it's very difficult for some patients, right? People who have to work, people who live in remote areas, et cetera, to participate sometimes in a formal clinical trial. So our hope is that digital tools, many of which have AI components to them, will help to make clinical trials more inclusive of different populations, and also, more efficient, because the costs go down if you can do things in people's homes instead of having to have hospital visits and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of aspects there, a lot of opportunity, I think, for making the clinical trial side more efficient.
Mark, I'll just offer a minor one. I think Esther and Corey really hit the high level ones. I think the last one is, as AI is revolutionizing lots of business processes, just the business process of actually enrolling patients, finding the sites, which sites are the best sites to use. AI can provide, better forecasting, better identification, just in just how we have to actually run the trial, which should also reduce costs as well, and actually improve speed and efficiency.
So there was an interesting, what I'd almost call a business model question in the chat, which, you may or may not have scope to react to, but I think it's, is AI important enough to introduce new types of competitors to this field? Sometimes when you have a technological change, it's not, Microsoft supplanted IBM and then Google came along. You don't necessarily have the big incumbent players that are the leaders in the next step. At the next step, could AI create more competition and new players that that your companies will be competing with, or could supplant your companies? Could the tech companies be coming in to compete, or new tech startups grow to compete with you using AI?
I guess I can start quickly. I'll be brief. I did mention this, and I do think that theoretically, yes. I think that there's interest, from the Amazons and the Apples and the Googles in doing this. There's a lot of health tech startups. I think, the reality is that, at least right now, we view most of those companies as partners, and we are partnering with a lot of them. We have, we work with Microsoft on all kinds of diagnostics for MS, because it turns out that doctors are pretty poor at judging, for example, the progression of MS in patients, how your movement's being affected by your disease. Computers are much better using, the kind of software that you see in Wii type games to assess slight changes and things. So we've partnered with a lot of these companies, big and small. I think the other advantage that pharma companies have, I mentioned we have 2 million patient years of data from decades of clinical trials that gives us a real head start and a real advantage of actual clinical data to mine, because this is data that we own. I think down the road, though, yes, I mean, there's a real potential for disruption, and that's why companies need to evolve in our space, and be aware of that and work together, as long as that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Corey mentioned. I think, as you said, Corey, long term, absolutely. Clearly, we're seeing lots of health startups in the drug discovery space. We're seeing lots in the monitoring, tools or even devices to monitor health. Our Fitbits and the like. I think the other piece that I think is clearly in the industry right now is that, Corey mentioned the data and the data that we have is a kind of an advantage or a head start right now, but also the experience, the regulatory experience. It's a very, very different world to bring these tools in the life sciences because of the regulatory constraints as opposed to perhaps in the tech industry. And so that also is a driver for I think, partnership and working together to bring some of these tools.
Yeah, so Valo is a company that's trying to do that, right? Like all of us could be at large pharma companies or large tech companies. We have about half of us are from the biopharma field and about half are from the tech field. And it's not a 100% from the tech field company for a reason, basically for the reasons that Derek outlaid, that there's a lot of expertise that is within pharma that you need in order to get actual drugs approved. You got to know what you're doing. At the same time, I'm constantly learning from my tech colleagues about different ways of working that I think should be applied, even absent AI, to biotech and to pharma that can really be transformative in themselves. So I think it's an exciting space, and we'll just see how things unfold over time.
Well, we've come up on the end of our time, and I think that maybe, sorry we couldn't get to all the questions or give you all a final word, but I think that kind of those forward-looking statements are a nice note to end on. So let's all give the panelists a virtual round of applause, and thank you all for participating. And once again, the CLE code was Alpha Victor Alpha. And thank you, everybody. And please stick around for the next panel. Thanks.